So you likely caught the headline. President Trump announced direct talks between Russia and Ukraine. And for a moment, there was maybe this flicker of hope.
Yeah, a flicker. But almost immediately, that seemed to get, well, overshadowed by some pretty serious doubts, especially coming out of Europe and from Ukraine itself.
Exactly. It was quite a stark difference in reaction, wasn't it?
It really was. You had this sort of initial, maybe optimistic take in the U.S. about a quick path, perhaps, to de-escalation. While in Europe and Ukraine, the response felt much more guarded. Informed by history, by the current situation on the ground.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive into whether these talks, these direct talks, actually have a real shot at leading to peace.
We've looked at quite a range of sources, news articles, sure, but also official EU documents, analysis pieces, trying to get a full picture.
Yeah, our goal here is to kind of cut through the noise, look at what different experts are saying, and also cover what the EU and the UK are doing at the same time. All without, drowning you in detail.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's start with that skepticism around Russia's motives. It feels like a really strong theme in, well, almost everything we read.
It really is. A key point coming from people like a former Russian diplomat, even a top Ukrainian military expert, is that Putin agreeing to talks, it might be more strategic than sincere.
A tactic.
Essentially, yeah. A way to look like they're open to a truce, perhaps ease some pressure, while actually using the time to beef up their military.
We've got a quote here, a pretty direct one from Boris Bondarev, that former diplomat. He basically said, the talks won't be talks because Moscow doesn't want real talks with Kyiv.
Wow, that's blunt.
It is. He goes on to say Russia sees Ukraine as just a tool, a proxy, that doesn't decide a thing by itself. That really gets to the core issue, doesn't it, this perception?
It absolutely does. It points to this fundamental imbalance in how Russia might view the situation, perhaps not fully recognizing Ukraine's own agency, its sovereignty.
Right.
Which suggests their goals might be much broader than just negotiating terms with Kyiv. It's about reshaping the whole regional dynamic, maybe.
It's not just words, is it? Our sources point to actions that seem to fly in the face of any real peace effort, like May 15th.
Yeah, that was significant. You had President Zelensky in Istanbul apparently ready for talks.
But Putin wasn't there.
Exactly. He chose not to attend, which, as one military analyst, LT Gallrimmer, pointed out, feels like a missed opportunity if you're serious about engagement. A bit of a snub, really.
And what was Russia doing that day?
Well, that's the other part. Simultaneously and in the days right after, they launched this huge wave of drone attacks against Ukrainian cities.
Huge numbers.
Massive. Like 112 drones reported on May 15th alone. And then just a few days later on the 18th, something like 273.
Wow.
It just doesn't square, does it? If you're genuinely looking for peace, why escalate attacks so dramatically right then?
It feels like sending completely opposite signals. Talk peace, but wage war even harder.
Which feeds right into that suspicion, doesn't it? That the talks are maybe just a facade.
And some analysts think there's a very specific reason for maybe wanting to drag these talks out, if they even happen properly.
Exactly. The idea is that by keeping the diplomatic track sort of open, even if it's not really moving, Putin gains valuable time.
Time for what?
To mobilize more troops. One Ukrainian expert suggested Russia could have a significant new force ready possibly by the end of June. And the goal then might be to grab more territory before the weather changes or before Ukraine can mount a stronger counteroffensive. It's tactical, potentially, played out under the cover of diplomacy.
So this illusion of talks, as some sources called it, could serve two purposes then. Military advantage and maybe a diplomatic shield.
That's the thinking. By appearing to engage, maybe Putin managed to stave off more U.S. sanctions, at least for a while. It creates a sort of narrative of cooperation, which might lessen international pressure, even while the actions on the ground tell a completely different story.
It's a complex game. And predictably, the reactions to the talks announcement itself were all over the place.
Oh, definitely. You saw the pro-Kremlin line emerge pretty quickly, that the talks were very successful, that Ukraine might end up accepting Russia's terms. Quite positive from their angle.
But that clashes pretty hard with what we're hearing from Ukrainian and European leaders, based on the reports.
Absolutely. The feeling there seems much more like apprehension, even alarm. Some reportedly called the initial setup a disaster for Ukraine.
Okay, a disaster.
Well, the underlying fear seemed to be that maybe President Trump's position was too closely aligned with Putin's, potentially sidelining Ukraine's core interests.
That's a huge gap in perception. And adding weight to that skepticism, we have Estonia's defense minister, Hanno Pevkur, just saying flat out, Russia actually doesn't want to end this war.
Yeah. It feels like there's a growing consensus among many European observers that Russia's commitment to a genuine peace process is, well, highly doubtful at this stage.
Okay, so that skepticism really sets the stage for what the EU and the UK are doing, right? They didn't wait around.
No, they didn't. And that was noted, both pushed ahead with pretty significant new sanctions packages against Russia without waiting for Washington, as some reports highlighted.
So maybe a slight difference in approach there, or at least timing?
Could be. Or just different priorities, different mechanisms kicking in. But yeah, the EU rolled out its 17th round of sanctions, and the UK announced about 100 new ones almost simultaneously.
Interesting coordination between Brussels and London then. What are these new sanctions actually targeting? What's the focus?
A big focus for the EU this time is what they're calling Moscow's shadow fleet.
Shadow fleet.
Yeah, basically tankers being used to move Russian oil around sneakily, getting past existing restrictions. It's like an underground oil network.
Ah. Okay, circumvention.
Exactly. Plus, they're going after financial institutions, helping Russia dodge earlier sanctions, and hitting the supply chains for Russia's arms manufacturers.
So, energy, finance, weapons production, trying to squeeze multiple pressure points.
Precisely. And the EU reports get quite specific about the tech being blocked.
Like what?
Things like chemical precursors for making explosives and propellants, stuff like sodium chlorate, aluminum powder, magnesium powder. They listed quite a few. The worry is they're being used for missiles.
Right.
And also targeting spare parts for high-precision machine tools, CNC machines, things like ball screws, encoders, components needed to keep Russia's military-industrial base running.
So it's not just finished weapons, it's the ingredients and the tools to make them. And they're going after the enablers too, right? Not just the goods.
Absolutely. The EU sanctions also hit individuals and companies involved in operating that shadow fleet. Entities in the UAE, Turkey, Hong Kong were mentioned, even an insurer.
Wow, quite a wide net.
It is. Nearly 200 ships were added in this round alone, bringing the total sanctioned vessels to around 350. And the UK's package also strongly focuses on disrupting those weapons supply chains.
It sounds like a really determined effort to make it harder and more expensive for Russia to keep the war going. And this focus on evasion, it's not entirely new for the EU, is it?
No, definitely not. Countering circumvention has been a major challenge and focus for a while. They introduced an anti-circumvention tool back in the 11th package.
Right.
And now they're tackling the shadow fleet head on. Plus, you have the EU sanctions envoy, David O'Sullivan, doing outreach to other countries to try and stop them being used as loopholes.
And didn't they also make it actually a crime now across the EU to break sanctions?
Yes, that's a big step. A directive from April 2024 requires all member states to set minimum criminal penalties for violating or trying to get around sanctions.
So actual jail time, fines.
Minimum prison sentences for individuals, yes, and potentially hefty fines for companies, sometimes linked to their global turnover. The aim is to standardize enforcement and make cooperation easier across borders.
That sounds like it should have some real teeth. And beyond these specific sanctions, there was also a broader trade measure.
That's right. The EU, along with other WTO members, suspended the most favored nation trade status for Russian goods and services.
Meaning?
Basically, it means Russian products face higher tariffs and less favorable treatment coming into the EU market, another layer of economic pressure.
Okay, so we have all these layers of sanctions, this effort to stop evasion. What's the actual measurable impact we're seeing on Russia's economy, on its trade with the EU?
Well, the impact on trade has been pretty dramatic. EU sanctions now cover over half of what they used to trade with Russia before the war.
Wow, over half.
And the actual trade volume has plummeted down about 75%. Russia's gone from being the EU's fifth biggest trading partner down to 15th. That's a huge shift.
That sounds really significant. But then you hear these reports that Russia's GDP is still growing somehow. How does that work?
It's a fair question. Russia's GDP has shown some growth, but the big driver behind that seems to be a massive ramp up in government military spending.
Okay. So it's not necessarily broad-based economic health.
Exactly. The underlying picture is more strained. Sanctions have definitely made things more expensive for Russian businesses. The ruble has weakened, and the central bank can't easily prop it up because so many of its foreign reserves are frozen.
Right, those immobilized assets.
Yeah. Plus, you're seeing reports of labor shortages, rising inflation, clear signs of economic stress, even if the headline GDP figure is propped up by war spending.
So the pain is there, even if it's partially masked. And the EU is now looking at using those frozen Russian assets themselves, right, to help Ukraine.
Yes, that's a major development. They've agreed to use the profits generated by those immobilized Russian central bank assets.
The profits, not the assets themselves.
Primarily the profits, yes. To provide financial aid to Ukraine, there was an initial payment planned. And beyond that, the G7 countries agreed on this plan for extraordinary revenue acceleration loans, ERA loans.
ERA loans.
Yeah, basically loans to Ukraine that will be paid back using the future income generated from those frozen Russian assets. It's a way to get funds to Ukraine faster, backed by Russia's own money, essentially.
That's quite innovative. And a clear signal.
Yeah.
So looking forward, what's the debate now? More sanctions. Better enforcement. Feels like a constant cycle.
It is. There's always discussion about what more could be done. Things like targeting the remaining Russian energy imports LNG, some pipeline gas exemptions still exist, expanding import bans to other goods, maybe fertilizers. And a really big one is tightening the enforcement of the oil price cap and clamping down harder on that shadow fleet.
And enforcement seems key. It's one thing to announce sanctions, another to make sure they actually work, right?
Absolutely. And one challenge mentioned is that quite a few multinational companies from sanctioning countries are actually still operating in Russia.
Really?
Yeah. Plus, there's constant need to block Russia getting battlefield goods and targeting the professionals, lawyers, consultants who help companies find ways around the rules.
And inside the EU itself, making sure all 27 countries are enforcing things consistently.
Yeah.
That sounds like a challenge, too.
It is. You've got over 160 different authorities involved across the member states. So ensuring consistency is tough. There's talk about needing maybe an EU version of OFAC, the U.S. sanctions agency, to centralize things, or using existing EU agencies better.
And the European Parliament? They seem to be pushing hard on this.
Oh, very much so. They consistently call for tougher sanctions, better oversight, more information sharing. They've specifically demanded things like banning Russian uranium and metals, ending nuclear cooperation, a full embargo on Russian energy and food products.
So really comprehensive demands.
Yes. And a big focus for them is also hitting those shadow fleets and just making sure the existing rules are actually being fully enforced everywhere.
Okay, so alongside all this talk about talks and sanctions, our sources also touch on Ukraine's future. Specifically its relationship with the EU. That seems critical long-term.
Definitely. Several analyses suggest that Ukraine's real long-term anchor is probably Europe, maybe even more than the U.S., just because of geography, economics, history. It's all deeply intertwined.
But joining the EU isn't exactly a walk in the park, is it? What are the main obstacles Ukraine faces there?
No, it's a complex process. There are several big hurdles. You've got populist movements within some EU countries that might resist expansion. Some member states need referendums to approve new members. That adds uncertainty.
Right.
You have known opposition from countries like Hungary. And the simple fact that Ukraine doesn't control all its territory right now is a major legal and political issue. Plus, internal EU debates, like over farm subsidies, could complicate things massively.
It sounds like a minefield, politically. And there's a risk, too, isn't there, that if this drags on too long, it could backfire inside Ukraine?
That's a real concern, yeah. If accession talks stall for years, you could see disillusionment grow in Ukraine. A feeling of being left out in the cold after making huge sacrifices could fuel Euroscepticism.
Which Russia could exploit, presumably.
Exactly. So while full membership is the goal, there's talk about maybe other ways to integrate more closely in the meantime.
Like what?
Well, one idea floated is Ukraine joining the European Economic Area, the EEA, like Norway or Iceland.
So access to the single market, free movement.
Pretty much, yeah. Access to the single market, free movement of people, goods, capital. Since EU labor markets are already open to Ukrainians, it might be a more politically achievable step in the medium term.
Interesting. But ultimately, the feeling is that Ukraine has a lot to offer the EU, despite the challenges.
Absolutely. The argument is Ukraine could significantly boost European security and offers huge economic potential, agriculture, tech, you name it. So the strategic importance is clear, even if the path is difficult.
Well, this has certainly been quite the deep dive, a lot of moving parts here. Maybe we should just quickly sum up the main threads before we finish.
Sure. So we started with that deep skepticism about the direct talks, many experts seeing them as potentially a Russian tactic, not a genuine peace effort. At the same time, the EU and UK are pushing ahead with more sanctions, really focusing now on closing loopholes, hitting the shadow fleet, targeting supply chains, and trying to make evasion a criminal offense.
And these sanctions are having an impact, clearly, on trade and the Russian economy, although maybe masked somewhat by military spending. And enforcement remains a key challenge.
Exactly. And finally, Ukraine's long-term focus seems firmly set on integrating with Europe, joining the EU eventually, despite some very real hurdles and political complexities on that road.
Okay, so that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Given everything we've discussed, the entrenched positions, the ongoing economic warfare through sanctions, the diplomatic maneuvering, what scenario do you think is most likely to actually bring about a lasting end to this conflict? And how do you see these parallel tracks, the potential, however slim, for talks, versus the relentless pressure of sanctions ultimately fitting together, or perhaps clashing in shaping that final outcome?
Yeah. That's a tough question with no easy answers.
Definitely a lot to think about. We hope this deep dive has given you a clearer view of the complex dynamics currently at play.